Emily Johnson had always craved adventure. At 28, she balanced her career as a freelance photographer with a deep love for the wilderness. Born and raised in Seattle, she was drawn to the untamed beauty of the Pacific Northwest. But her latest idea took her passion to a new level. One crisp fall evening, over a table littered with coffee mugs and trail maps, she pitched her plan to her two closest friends. "Guys," Emily began, her voice laced with excitement, "I've been researching this national park near the Cascade Range. It's untouched, wild, and practically begging to be explored." Mike, her college friend turned software engineer, looked skeptical. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his baseball cap. "You mean the kind of place where people vanish because there's no cell service?" Emily rolled her eyes. "It's not like that. It's a chance to get away from the noise, completely unplug." Sarah, the group's voice of reason and an elementary school teacher, frowned slightly. "As long as we're not going alone. I'm not risking bear encounters or getting lost. A guide is non-negotiable." "Already thought of that," Emily said, tapping a contact on her phone. "Tom Daniels, retired park ranger, 20 years of experience." The following weekend, they were off. The Jeep Wrangler they rented was packed with camping gear, first aid supplies, and enough snacks to sustain them for days. Emily drove, her eyes darting between the twisting road and the thick pine forests that lined it. Tom, their guide, sat up front, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of years spent outdoors. "This area's no joke," Tom warned, his gruff voice breaking the silence. "Most folks stick to the main trails. Where we're going, it's easy to lose your bearings." Mike shifted uneasily in his seat. "Define easy." Tom smirked slightly. "Let's just say, don't wander off." The group soon arrived at the trailhead, a secluded spot with no other vehicles in sight. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As they unloaded their gear, Tom pointed out distant peaks and the faint rustle of wildlife nearby. "This," Emily whispered, her camera already in hand, "is exactly what I was looking for." But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest, even Emily felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't just an adventure. It was an unpredictable journey into the wild unknown. The morning sun filtered through the towering pines, casting golden streaks over the forest floor. Emily, Mike, Sarah, and Tom started their trek, their boots crunching on the carpet of fallen leaves and moss. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint aroma of cedar and wildflowers. Emily walked ahead, her camera slung around her neck, ready to capture anything remarkable. "Is it always this quiet?" Mike asked, his voice hushed as though he feared disturbing the serenity. "Not always," Tom replied, glancing over his shoulder. His broad frame and well-worn hiking boots made him seem like he belonged here. "You'll hear the forest wake up soon. Birds, maybe some coyotes in the distance. But keep an ear out. Sometimes, silence means something's watching." Sarah shot him a sharp look. "You could have left that part out." Tom chuckled, adjusting his pack. "Relax. Most of the time, they're more afraid of you than you are of them." They moved deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller and the path narrower. Soon, the sounds of nature enveloped them. Chirping birds, the rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush, and the occasional distant call of a hawk. Emily was in her element, pausing frequently to snap photos of moss-covered rocks or beams of sunlight piercing through the canopy. "This place is incredible," she said, stopping to capture a vibrant red mushroom nestled against the base of an old tree. "It's like stepping into another world." Mike, less enthusiastic, swatted at a mosquito buzzing near his ear. "Yeah, a world where bugs think I'm dinner." As they continued, Tom began sharing stories about the park's biodiversity. He pointed out claw marks on a tree, evidence of a black bear sharpening its claws, and explained the importance of certain plants to the ecosystem. Sarah, ever the learner, peppered him with questions about the animals they might encounter. "What about gorillas?" Emily asked suddenly, a playful grin on her face. Tom stopped walking and turned to her, his expression serious. "There are no gorillas here," he said flatly. "Not naturally, anyway." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Mike tried to laugh it off. "What does that even mean?" Tom shrugged, his tone nonchalant but his eyes sharp. Just saying, people report all kinds of strange sightings. But don't worry, most of it's just campfire stories. The group pressed on, the mood slightly more subdued. As the forest grew denser, the trail became harder to navigate. Vines and ferns crept over the path, and the trees stood closer together, their branches forming a thick, tangled canopy overhead. Emily paused, her hand on a tree for balance, and looked around. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something else. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing Emily's hesitation. "Yeah," Emily replied, shaking off the feeling. "Let's keep going." Unbeknownst to them, their adventure was about to take a turn they could never have anticipated. The group trudged on, weaving their way through the increasingly rugged terrain. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy now, casting a shadowy gloom over the forest floor. Emily's excitement was tempered by the subtle unease she felt but couldn't quite name. The others seemed to feel it too. Conversations became sparse, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made Mike glance nervously over his shoulder. "Tom," Sarah said, her voice low, "are we still on the trail?" Tom stopped and studied the surroundings with practiced precision. "We're close enough. This area isn't marked well, but I know where we're heading. Stay close." Emily noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross Tom's face. She didn't mention it, but her grip on her camera tightened. As they moved forward, she fell into a rhythm, her eyes scanning for interesting shots. It was just as she raised her camera to capture a particularly twisted tree trunk that she heard it. A deep, guttural grunt. She froze. The sound was close, too close. Her head snapped toward the others. Tom had stopped mid-step, his hand raised to signal silence. His expression was unreadable, but his body was tense, like a coiled spring. "What was that?" Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for everyone to stay still. The forest, usually alive with sound, had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then it came again. A louder grunt, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crushing the undergrowth. The ground seemed to vibrate with each step. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the dense forest ahead. That's when she saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a massive figure, unlike anything she'd ever imagined. It was a gorilla, or at least it looked like one, but it was far larger than any gorilla she had seen in photos or documentaries. Its dark fur glistened in the faint light, and its muscles rippled with each deliberate movement. The creature's deep-set eyes locked onto the group, its gaze intense and unwavering. "Stay calm," Tom said in a hushed tone, his hand subtly moving toward the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Don't make any sudden moves." Mike's face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the straps of his backpack. "Is this real? What do we do?" The gorilla stepped closer, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She glanced at Sarah, who looked equally terrified, her lips pressed into a thin line to keep from screaming. "Tom," Emily whispered, her voice shaking, "what is that thing doing here? Gorillas don't live here." "I don't know," Tom replied, his voice strained, "but we need to back away." Slowly, as they began to inch backward, the creature let out a thunderous roar that echoed through the forest. The sound was so loud and primal that it felt like the air itself vibrated. Emily's pulse raced as she stumbled on a root, her ankle twisting awkwardly. Pain shot through her leg, and she collapsed to the ground with a sharp cry. The gorilla turned its attention to her, its massive frame now fully focused on the fallen figure. "Emily," Sarah yelled, starting to move toward her, but Tom grabbed her arm. "Don't," he hissed. "Stay back. Let me handle this." The creature began to move toward Emily, its massive hands brushing branches aside like they were paper. Emily, paralyzed by pain and fear, locked eyes with it. It was close enough now for her to see the intelligence flickering behind its gaze, something more than just animal instinct. Tom stepped forward, his knife in hand. But the gorilla let out another deafening roar, forcing him to stop in his tracks. Emily's breaths came in short, shallow gasps. She closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. But the worst didn't come. Instead, the gorilla crouched down, its massive form looming over her like a shadow. Its movements were deliberate, almost curious, as it leaned closer, its breath warm and heavy against her face. Emily's mind raced as the enormous creature leaned in closer. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to do something. But the pain in her leg and the sheer enormity of the gorilla froze her in place. Its deep, dark eyes studied her, its massive chest rising and falling with each slow breath. Tom, standing a few feet away, gripped his knife tighter, his knuckles white. "Emily, don't move," he said in a low, controlled voice. "Just stay still." I can't," she stammered, wincing as a sharp pain shot through her leg when she tried to shift. The gorilla grunted again, its attention momentarily drawn to Tom's voice. It straightened slightly, towering over Emily, its presence both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Mike and Sarah stood frozen a few steps back, their faces pale and eyes wide. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered urgently to Tom. "Stay quiet," Tom replied without looking back. "And don't run. If it feels threatened, it'll charge." Emily's breaths were shallow as she tried to control the panic rising in her chest. She dared not look away from the creature, afraid that any sudden movement would provoke it. But as it crouched again, its massive hand brushing against the ground beside her, something unexpected happened. The gorilla reached out, its fingers gently brushing against Emily's injured leg. She flinched, expecting pain, but its touch was surprisingly light, almost cautious. The creature sniffed the air again, its gaze flicking between her and the rest of the group. It's checking her out," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. "Quiet," Tom snapped, his voice sharper than intended. The gorilla's head whipped toward him, and it let out a low, rumbling growl. Tom took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Okay," he said slowly. "Easy, big guy. No one's going to hurt you." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes, a mix of fear and the overwhelming pain radiating from her leg. She glanced down and saw the swelling. Her ankle was badly twisted, possibly broken. There was no way she could stand, let alone escape if things went south. Suddenly, the gorilla did something that took everyone by surprise. It wrapped one massive hand around Emily's waist, effortlessly lifting her off the ground. She let out a startled cry, her hands instinctively grabbing onto its thick fur for balance. "Emily," Sarah shouted, taking a step forward. "Don't," Tom barked, holding her back. "Let it be. We don't know what it's doing yet." The gorilla cradled Emily like she weighed nothing, its grip firm but not crushing. It turned and began walking away, its long strides carrying them deeper into the forest. "Tom, we can't just let it take her," Mike exclaimed, panic rising in his voice. "We don't have a choice," Tom replied grimly, his eyes fixed on the retreating figure. "If we chase after it, we risk provoking it. We need a plan." Emily, held tightly in the gorilla's arms, could hear the voices of her friends growing fainter as the creature carried her farther into the dense forest. She bit her lip, trying to suppress the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Her mind raced with questions. Why was it taking her? What did it want? And most importantly, would she survive whatever came next? The forest seemed to grow darker as the gorilla carried Emily deeper into its domain. The distant voices of her friends had long faded, replaced by the eerie quiet of the dense wilderness. Every bounce of the creature's stride sent a jolt of pain through her injured leg, but she gritted her teeth, trying to remain silent. She could feel the warmth of the gorilla's fur against her hands, its powerful muscles moving fluidly beneath her. Her thoughts swirled in panic. Why hadn't it attacked? What did it want? And, most importantly, how was she going to get out of this alive? The creature slowed as it approached a small clearing surrounded by towering fir trees. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss-covered ground and the entrance to a rocky outcrop. It was a cave, partially hidden by overgrown ferns and vines. The gorilla ducked its massive head and carried her inside. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, smelling of earth and stone. Emily could hear the faint dripping of water deeper within. The gorilla set her down gently on a soft bed of dried leaves and moss, its dark eyes watching her intently. She winced as she adjusted her position, trying to ease the throbbing pain in her leg. For a few tense moments, neither of them moved. Emily's breath came in shallow bursts, her eyes darting around the cave for anything that might serve as an escape route. The gorilla, meanwhile, sat down a few feet away, its gaze fixed on her. Its posture was relaxed but alert, as if it were guarding her from something unseen. Emily's fingers brushed against her backpack, which she had managed to keep hold of during the ordeal. Her heart leaped when she felt the outline of her phone inside. With painstaking slowness, she unzipped the bag, trying to avoid drawing the gorilla's attention. The screen was cracked, and the battery icon was dangerously low, but the device powered on. "Please, please, please," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she navigated to the emergency call feature. She pressed the button, holding her breath as the call connected. 911. "What's your emergency?" The voice on the other end was faint, but clear enough. "I've been taken by an animal," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "A gorilla. I don't know where I am, but I'm somewhere in the Cascade Forests. Please, send help." The gorilla's head tilted at the sound of her voice. It let out a low grunt, its eyes narrowing slightly. Emily quickly ended the call, hoping the location ping had gone through. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slipped the phone back into her bag. Minutes felt like hours as she sat in the cave, the gorilla keeping a watchful eye on her. Every time she shifted, it reacted, sometimes with a grunt, other times with a curious tilt of its head. It wasn't hostile, but its presence was undeniably intimidating. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the silence. A rustling of leaves, followed by voices. Her heart leaped. It had to be her friends or a rescue team. The gorilla stood abruptly, its massive frame blocking the cave entrance. It let out a deep, warning growl, its posture shifting to one of heightened alertness. Emily's hope turned to dread as she realized that whatever was coming might not be friendly. "Please," she whispered under her breath, clutching her backpack tightly. "Please let it be them." The gorilla moved closer to the entrance, its presence now not just intimidating but protective. For the first time, Emily wondered if this creature wasn't her captor, but her unlikely guardian. The rustling outside the cave grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices and the crack of branches breaking underfoot. Emily strained her ears, hoping to catch something recognizable. Her friends' voices, maybe the familiar cadence of Tom's measured tone. But the gorilla stood like a stone sentinel at the entrance, its broad shoulders casting an imposing shadow across the cave floor. "Tom," Emily dared to call out, her voice barely above a whisper. The gorilla turned its head sharply toward her, a low grunt rumbling from its chest. It wasn't a warning, but it silenced her all the same. Seconds passed, and then the voices ceased. The forest outside fell into an unsettling stillness. Emily's breathing quickened as her mind raced. Was it rescuers? Predators? Or something else entirely? The gorilla seemed to make a decision. With a surprising gentleness for a creature of its size, it turned back to Emily and knelt beside her. Without hesitation, it scooped her up again, one massive hand supporting her back and the other under her legs. She let out a small cry as her injured leg shifted, but the gorilla didn't falter. It moved with purpose, its stride steady as it carried her out of the cave. The transition from the dim cave to the dappled sunlight of the forest was disorienting. Emily blinked against the sudden brightness, her arms instinctively wrapping around the gorilla's neck for stability. She could feel the powerful muscles beneath its thick fur, each step sending subtle vibrations through its body. Where are you taking me?" she whispered, as if expecting an answer. The gorilla, of course, offered none, but its movements were deliberate. It wasn't running or panicked, it was guiding her somewhere. The forest seemed even denser now, the trees towering overhead like ancient guardians. The air was cooler here, the ground softer with a thick layer of moss. Occasionally, The gorilla paused, sniffing the air or glancing around before continuing. Emily caught glimpses of wildlife, deer darting through the underbrush, a hawk circling high above, but none of the animals seemed to pay them any attention. It was as if the gorilla's presence commanded respect, even from the other creatures of the forest. After what felt like an eternity, the gorilla stopped at the edge of a secluded clearing. The area was stunningly serene, a small brook winding its way through lush greenery. The sound of the water was soothing, its gentle babble filling the otherwise quiet space. In the center of the clearing stood another rocky outcrop, smaller than the cave, but partially shaded by the overhanging branches of an ancient oak tree. The gorilla set her down carefully near the brook, its large hands steadying her as she adjusted herself into a more comfortable position. Emily winced, her leg throbbing from the movement, but the cool air and soft moss beneath her offered some relief. For the first time, the gorilla seemed to relax. It sat down a few feet away, watching her with an intensity that was almost human. Emily couldn't help but meet its gaze, a mix of fear, gratitude, and curiosity swirling in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked aloud, her voice breaking. She didn't expect an answer, but voicing the question felt necessary. The gorilla tilted its head slightly, as if trying to understand her words. Emily shifted, pulling her backpack closer. She fumbled for her water bottle and took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. Her phone, still tucked away, was her lifeline. She debated whether to attempt another call but hesitated. The gorilla's behavior confused her. Was it protecting her, or was there a deeper instinct at play? She wasn't ready to risk provoking it again with more noise. As the day wore on, the gorilla remained close, its posture calm but alert. It occasionally rose, pacing the clearing and sniffing the air, as though ensuring the area was safe. Emily watched its every move, a mixture of fear and fascination growing within her. For now, she was alive. But the question loomed larger with each passing moment. Was this creature her savior, or had it brought her here for reasons she couldn't yet comprehend? The clearing was bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon, the sun filtering through the leaves like shards of light cutting through the shadows. Emily sat with her back against a smooth rock near the brook, her injured legs stretched out carefully in front of her. She had begun to notice the subtle behaviors of the gorilla, its constant scanning of the surroundings, the way it would pause mid-stride and listen, its body always poised to act. It wasn't just an animal, it was acting as a sentinel. Emily shifted slightly, wincing as her leg throbbed in protest. The gorilla, sitting a few feet away, immediately turned its head toward her, its sharp eyes narrowing in concern, or what looked like concern. "It's okay," Emily murmured, her voice soft. "Just hurts, that's all." To her astonishment, the gorilla grunted low, almost as if responding to her words. It shifted closer, but stayed far enough to avoid overwhelming her. Emily felt her fear giving way to curiosity. This creature, so massive and powerful, didn't seem intent on harming her. Instead, it seemed to have taken on the role of protector. The soft trickle of the brook provided a soothing background sound as Emily tried to gather her thoughts. Her mind drifted back to her friends. Were they safe? Were they searching for her? And what about the rescue team she had managed to contact? She reached into her backpack and carefully pulled out her phone. The cracked screen flickered to life, but the battery icon was flashing red. Her stomach sank. If help didn't arrive soon, her connection to the outside world would be gone. As if sensing her unease, the gorilla let out a low rumble and shifted its gaze toward the forest. Its ears twitched slightly, and it rose to its feet, its massive frame towering over her once more. Emily felt a pang of both reassurance and dread. It was watching for something. "What is it?" she whispered, even though she knew the gorilla couldn't answer. The creature paced the perimeter of the clearing, its movements deliberate and cautious. Occasionally, it would stop, sniff the air, and glance back at her before continuing its patrol. Emily couldn't help but marvel at its presence. Every movement was deliberate, every action seemed purposeful. She had never seen anything like it. Hours passed, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The gorilla remained vigilant, and Emily found herself feeling an odd sense of safety in its presence. When the first drops of rain began to fall, she instinctively pulled her jacket tighter around herself. The gorilla, however, moved quickly. It reached into the overhanging branches of a nearby tree, pulling down large, leafy fronds. To Emily's astonishment, it brought them over to her, carefully arranging them above her to shield her from the rain. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the gorilla's deliberate efforts. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not just an animal, are you?" The gorilla didn't respond, of course, but it sat down near the edge of the clearing, its body forming a barrier between her and the forest beyond. Emily watched it, her fear now fully replaced by awe and confusion. This creature wasn't acting out of aggression or instinct alone. It seemed to have a sense of empathy, a protective instinct that rivaled anything she had ever seen in the human world. As the rain continued to fall, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For now, she was safe. Whatever else lay ahead, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The gorilla had made sure of that. The rain subsided as the evening deepened, leaving the forest damp and glistening in the fading light. Emily shivered slightly, the chill of the damp air creeping into her bones. The gorilla remained near the clearing's edge, its posture alert but not tense. She wondered if it ever rested, or if its constant vigilance was simply part of its nature. Emily checked her phone again, the cracked screen now displaying a faint glow as the battery dwindled dangerously close to zero. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the emergency call button. This might be her last chance to signal for help. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. The line connected, and a faint voice answered almost immediately. 911. "What's your emergency?" Her heart raced. "This is Emily Johnson. I'm lost in the Cascade Forests. I was taken by," she paused, glancing at the gorilla, which had turned its head toward the sound of her voice. "By an animal. A gorilla. I'm injured, and I don't know where I am." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Emily, do you see any landmarks? Can you describe your surroundings?" "I'm in a clearing near a stream," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "It's surrounded by dense forest. There's no trail. I don't know how far I've been carried. Stay on the line if you can. We're tracking your call's location. Help is on the way." The phone beeped. "Low battery warning. Please hurry," Emily said desperately. "My phone." The line went dead. She stared at the screen as it faded to black, a knot tightening in her chest. She shoved the phone back into her backpack, her hands trembling. Tears pricked her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Breaking down wouldn't help her now. The gorilla let out a low grunt, its eyes fixed on her. It moved closer, sitting a few feet away, its gaze almost questioning. Emily felt a strange urge to speak to it, to explain herself, even though she knew it couldn't understand. "Help is coming," she said softly, her voice shaking. "At least, I hope it is." The gorilla tilted its head, its dark eyes studying her with an intensity that was both unsettling and comforting. It didn't move closer, but its presence was enough to remind her that, for better or worse, she wasn't alone. The minutes stretched into hours, the darkness of night creeping into the clearing. Emily's thoughts turned to her friends. Were they safe? Had they managed to alert authorities? She could only hope that Tom's expertise and level-headedness had kept them together and moving towards safety. Suddenly, the gorilla's ears twitched, and it stood, its body tense. Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What is it?" she whispered, as if the creature would answer. The distant sound of helicopter blades broke the silence, their rhythmic chopping growing louder. Emily's heart leaped. Rescue. It had to be. The gorilla moved toward the clearing's edge, its posture wary. The sound of voices and faint beams of light cutting through the forest followed. She recognized them, Tom's deep, steady tone and Sarah's higher, worried one. Relief flooded her. "Over here," Emily called out, her voice cracking. "I'm here." The voices grew louder, closer, and then she saw them. Tom, Mike, and Sarah emerged from the dense forest, followed by two rescue workers in bright jackets. Sarah broke into a run, tears streaming down her face. "Emily!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside her. "Oh my God, you're okay." Emily's relief was short-lived. The gorilla, now fully visible in the clearing, let out a low warning growl. The rescue team froze, their flashlights catching its massive frame. "Back up slowly," Tom instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Don't provoke it." "No," Emily said quickly, shaking her head. "It's not attacking. It helped me." Her words were met with stunned silence. The gorilla remained still, its eyes darting between Emily and the group. After what felt like an eternity, it stepped back, its gaze lingering on her one last time before it turned and disappeared into the forest. Emily's chest tightened as she watched it go, a mix of gratitude and loss washing over her. "It saved me," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching helicopter. The rescue team helped her onto a stretcher, their questions coming in rapid succession, but Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. She glanced back at the forest, hoping for one last glimpse of the creature that had defied everything she thought she knew about the wild. It was gone. The rotor blades of the helicopter sliced through the night air, their rhythmic thrum echoing across the forest. Emily lay on the stretcher, her body trembling from exhaustion and the pain in her leg, but her mind was elsewhere, on the gorilla. She craned her neck, searching the tree line for any sign of the creature, but it had vanished into the dense shadows of the wilderness. Tom knelt beside her, his face etched with relief and concern. "We've got you now, Emily. You're safe." She managed a weak smile, her voice hoarse. "It didn't hurt me. It carried me, protected me." Tom nodded, his brow furrowed. "We saw it. I've never seen anything like that in my life." "Are you sure it didn't attack?" "No," Emily said firmly, shaking her head. "It saved me, Tom. It even shielded me from the rain. I don't know why, but it wasn't acting like an animal." Sarah knelt on Emily's other side, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we'd lost you," she said, her voice breaking. "When we saw the cave empty, I was terrified." "It's okay," Emily whispered, reaching out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "I'm here." The rescue workers busied themselves preparing Emily for the helicopter ride. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, gave Emily a reassuring smile. "We'll get you to the hospital soon. You're going to be fine." As they secured the stretcher, Emily's mind raced with unanswered questions. What had the gorilla been doing in the Cascade forests? Gorillas weren't native to this part of the world. Had it been abandoned, escaped from captivity, or was it something else entirely? And why had it chosen to protect her rather than attack? Mike stood off to the side, visibly shaken. He clutched the straps of his backpack, his lips pressed into a thin line. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for, Em," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of admiration and guilt. The rescue workers began lifting her stretcher, and she felt the rush of air as the helicopter's rotors picked up speed. As they loaded her into the aircraft, she caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The forest stood still, its towering trees swaying slightly in the breeze. The gorilla was gone, but its presence lingered in her mind like a shadow. The helicopter lifted off, and the ground below faded into darkness. Emily leaned back, exhaustion overtaking her, but her thoughts refused to settle. She closed her eyes, the memory of the gorilla's protective gaze replaying in her mind. Whatever it was, an anomaly, a freak occurrence, it had reshaped her understanding of the wild. The rotor blades of the helicopter sliced through the night air, their rhythmic thrum echoing across the forest. Emily lay on the stretcher, her body trembling from exhaustion and the pain in her leg, but her mind was elsewhere, on the gorilla. She craned her neck, searching the tree line for any sign of the creature, but it had vanished into the dense shadows of the wilderness. Tom knelt beside her, his face etched with relief and concern. "We've got you now, Emily. You're safe." She managed a weak smile, her voice hoarse. "It didn't hurt me. It carried me, protected me." Tom nodded, his brow furrowed. "We saw it. I've never seen anything like that in my life." "Are you sure it didn't attack?" "No," Emily said firmly, shaking her head. "It saved me, Tom. It even shielded me from the rain. I don't know why, But it wasn't acting like an animal. Sarah knelt on Emily's other side, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we'd lost you," she said, her voice breaking. "When we saw the cave empty, I was terrified." "It's okay," Emily whispered, reaching out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "I'm here." The rescue workers busied themselves preparing Emily for the helicopter ride. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, gave Emily a reassuring smile. "We'll get you to the hospital soon. You're going to be fine." As they secured the stretcher, Emily's mind raced with unanswered questions. What had the gorilla been doing in the Cascade forests? Gorillas weren't native to this part of the world. Had it been abandoned, escaped from captivity, or was it something else entirely? And why had it chosen to protect her rather than attack? Mike stood off to the side, visibly shaken. He clutched the straps of his backpack, his lips pressed into a thin line. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for, Em," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of admiration and guilt. The rescue workers began lifting her stretcher, and she felt the rush of air as the helicopter's rotors picked up speed. As they loaded her into the aircraft, she caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The forest stood still, its towering trees swaying slightly in the breeze. The gorilla was gone, but its presence lingered in her mind like a shadow. The helicopter lifted off, and the ground below faded into darkness. Emily leaned back, exhaustion overtaking her, but her thoughts refused to settle. She closed her eyes, the memory of the gorilla's protective gaze replaying in her mind. Whatever it was, an anomaly, a freak occurrence, it had reshaped her understanding of the wild. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses in the hallway. Emily sat propped up in the hospital bed, her leg encased in a thick cast. Her friends had come and gone throughout the day, bringing flowers, snacks, and updates from the rescue team. But now, in the quiet of the evening, she finally had time to reflect. Her phone, now fully charged thanks to Sarah's insistence, buzzed on the bedside table. It was flooded with messages from curious friends and reporters who had somehow caught wind of the bizarre encounter. Emily ignored them. She wasn't ready to share her story with the world. Not yet. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Tom stepped in, holding a small notebook. He gave her a nod, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "You've been through a lot," he said, his voice low. "How are you holding up?" Emily shrugged, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Physically? I'll heal. Mentally? I don't know. I keep thinking about it. That gorilla wasn't just acting on instinct, Tom. It had a purpose." Tom leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "In all my years out there, I've never seen anything like it. But you're right. It wasn't just an animal. There was something else going on." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the experience settling between them. Finally, Emily spoke again. "Do you think people will believe me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom smiled, a rare expression of warmth crossing his weathered face. "It doesn't matter if they do or don't. You know what happened, and it changed you. That's what counts." Emily nodded, her mind drifting back to the gorilla. She thought of the moments when it had shielded her, carried her, and watched over her like a guardian. It was a lesson she would carry with her forever. That even in the wildest, most unexpected places, empathy could thrive. As Tom stood to leave, Emily stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if the forest and the creature that had saved her were still with her, whispering a truth she couldn't quite put into words. It was a story she might never fully understand, but one she would never forget. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.